There is a problem with today's Christianity when it comes to the life and story of Judas. It is in fact Judas one of the disciples that we forget about. We don't really talk about Judas because, of course, of the scandalous act that Judas was known for and is known for. Which is a crazy, because the story of Judas, when it comes to all the disciples, in fact, he has the most powerful message of them all. The untold, or the Gospel of Judas, is one that is life-changing and also forgotten, which should actually bring concern, only because Judas himself, or the life of Judas, or the Gospel of Judas, brings some insight and heavenly insight to how Jesus Christ called us and what he looks for in us. When we look into Judas, who's perhaps the most scandalous story of the century that we know of, we know him and I only identify him as the man who created the most gruesome act in history. Judas is known as oftentimes the greatest criminal. Many people actually like to involve Judas or mention Judas or affiliate Judas with people who either hurt them or left them or even betrayed them. In fact, there's even ministers or people out there who will actually name a spirit behind Judas, as if Judas himself is the definition of betrayal. And we often forget two things when it comes to the life of Judas. Number one, he was a disciple of the Messiah. He graduated from a disciple to an apostle. When we overlook this aspect, when you look into Matthew chapter 10 verses 1 through 4, we see, like many of us, Judas was actually called. He had a heavenly calling, an obligation, and also a duty to carry out God's kingdom. He was called with a purpose. The second thing that we often overlook is that Judas indeed had a real relationship with Jesus. And what tells us this is because what makes us say this is because Judas himself was in charge of perhaps the most important aspect in ministry, which was the finances. He was taking charge and took charge of Jesus's personal resources, which then lead us to believe that Judas himself never had any type of intentions of betraying the Messiah. When we look into it, he was one that not only talked with Jesus and spoke with Jesus, but even throughout the disciples who questioned and challenged the identity of the Messiah, you see that Judas was never included in any of that. In fact, some scholars actually believe that Judas was more convinced than any of the disciples who Jesus was, who Jesus said he was. So when we look into the life of Judas, you see Peter, James, and John always had this dispute amongst themselves in questioning Jesus. In fact, none of them, even throughout scriptures, we know of a disciple who is the only one mentioned as the one Jesus loved, and he himself was never in charge of his personal resources as of yet, until later on after ascension. So when you look into it, you see that Jesus gave Judas his personal finances, in charge of his finances, and in Matthew chapter 6 verse 21 says that where your treasure is, there is also your heart. So when you look into that and you use critical thinking in that aspect, you end up realizing that Jesus truly loved Judas just as much as John, the one that Jesus loved. In fact, I even dare to say that after John, Judas was the second one that he loved the most. And when we look at it, when we look into scriptures and scholars, they actually oftentimes believe that Judas now was not only a businessman, but a busy man, but a well-resolved man. He was no different than the other disciples. Peter denied him. Thomas did not believe. Yet Judas, there was no statement in the New Testament scriptures, at least, which was him opposing or questioning who Jesus was. So that only leads us to believe that Judas himself was more convinced than any of the other disciples that Jesus was who he said he was. And when you look into John chapter 13, verses 18 all the way down to 30, which is the Last Supper, there are three things in the life of Judas that makes it the most powerful and greatest message which have truly been forgotten by modern day Christianity. And the first thing that he teaches us is found in two acts that he commits, and it is the possibility to be with Jesus and betray him. You see, in the Last Supper, you see that Judas was sitting down, and Jesus begins to be troubled in spirit and says, one of you will betray me. And all of the disciples begin to talk amongst within themselves, asking, who will it be? That tells me that they all had the ability or not the desire, but the ability to be able to betray the Messiah. And you see that the disciples lean over to John and says, ask him who it is. And then during that time, you end up seeing that Jesus says, the one that I will dip my bread, my hand, the one who will dip my bread in it with their hands. And he then dips the bread and gives it to Judas. And you see that they dip and they somewhat like touch when they dip the bread, because it was almost like if there was a power of an agreement that was coming, where Jesus then says, that what you do it quick, right? So it's like we almost get a glimpse that Jesus and Judas was coming into an agreement of the events that will be following. And scriptures declare in the book of Matthew 18 that when two or more agree, so shall it be done. The second act that we actually see was the kiss that Judas gave Jesus. And usually a kiss is oftentimes affiliated with intimacy, right? So the second act that Judas did was a kiss, the final kiss, to be able to allow the religious leaders to identify who Jesus was. So he kisses Jesus in the face, and not once did you see that Jesus rejected Judas. Perhaps the reason why Jesus never rejected Judas during that time was because he was still desiring to be with Judas, to communicate with Judas, to be with Judas. And during this time, you see that Judas ends up kissing Jesus. Judas kisses Jesus in the face as the final act of betrayal to carry out his agenda. And Jesus never rejected that final kiss. Perhaps it was because he understood the most significant part of Judas and what the role that Judas would play in the future, right? When we look into it, it teaches us that it is possible to kiss Jesus and to touch Jesus and still leave him. This part speaks even to our souls, that it tells us that it is possible to touch him and kiss him, yet still deny, reject, and leave him. The truth is that there's a little bit of Judas in us all. At some point, we all had a bit of Judas in us. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 4 through 6, the writer gives us a glimpse into this where it's like we almost forget how fresh the wounds of Jesus are. It is possible to experience the good works of God and opt out in what he has, and by doing so, you actually bring into crucifixion the Son of God all over again. This is why Hebrews chapter 6 says that when you commit sin, it's like you bring into crucifixion the Son of God all over again. The truth is that we oftentimes forget how fresh these wounds are. And the reality is that we all had a bit of Judas. There is a reality in us that we all had, just like Judas, traded Jesus in for something. It may not be currency, but it may be the job that you have. It may be the man or the woman that you're talking to. It may be the money. There's a little bit of Judas in you all, in us all. There's a little bit of Judas in you. There's a point in time where you have traded Jesus for that one thing that you desired the most. The second thing that Judas teaches us is that it is possible to become wrapped around your theology and or doctrine, if you will, that you miss that thing that God wants to do. Just to give you a little background, when you look into the life and story of Judas, not only was he a busy man and a resolved man, he was more convinced of who Jesus was and who Jesus said he was, that he was so wrapped around the idea of a Messiah coming to govern and rule the nations that he missed the simple fact that the Messiah's first coming was not to condemn the world and judge the world and govern it, but to save it from sin. So Judas not only teaches us that it's possible to touch and kiss and see Jesus and leave him, betray him, but he also teaches us that we can be wrapped around our theology and our truth to a point that we miss what God is doing. There is, in that time, when you look into it, the idea of a Messiah to come was the idea of a Messiah to come and rule with a scepter. This is validated when Jesus is taken in by the religious leaders, and when they ask him, "Are you the one to come?" And what does he say? That's his final blow. He says, "I am." And so that you know that the Son of Man has authority, you shall see him coming at the clouds. During the time that you will see him coming at the clouds with the Father. And they all rip their garments and say blasphemy. And then he says something interesting. Don't you think that I can call a legion of my Father's angels and they will come to save me? Judas was so wrapped around his theology and doctrine that he literally believed that Jesus himself was giving him the authority to speed up the coming of Jesus. This is validated by the statement that Jesus did. And the third thing that Judas teaches us, it is perhaps the most powerful message that speaks to us to this day. So not only did Judas betray the Son of Man, the Messiah, like many of you do, like you have done, not only was he wrapped around his theology to the point where he neglected his brothers and neglected everybody else. When he turned into a madman, he goes ahead, decides to betray Jesus, wrapped around his theology, wrapped around his doctrine, thinking that he was in the right. And he betrays the Son of Man. And during that time that he betrays the Son of Man, he also betrayed his fellow brothers and never returns to them. And as a madman, he goes crazy. And unfortunately, Judas himself did not live long enough like the other disciples to write a book. But I'm pretty sure if he wrote a book and never committed the act that he committed, he would have been saved, and we would have had an additional book in the scriptures made by Judas. But his message speaks even to today. And after experiencing the betrayal of innocent blood, he then regrets it, rejects his brothers in Christ. So therefore, because he was wrapped around his theology, he rejects everybody. There is an issue when you continue in a truth that only you believe and call it God is elevating you to a new level, when in reality you are in error. So he goes ahead, wrapped around his theology, and rejects the others, turns into a madman, and then you see the event in which he takes his life. And this is a powerful message only because although he didn't live long enough and was blessed enough to a point where he can see what was about to happen like the other disciples did. This is why Peter was able to deny Jesus but yet remain in Jesus, because he was able to not only communicate with his brothers and sisters and fellowship with his brothers, but he was also able to see the Messiah that was to resurrect. Catherine Coleman once said, any truth, no matter how valid, if emphasized to the exclusion of other truths of equal importance, is practical error. In other words, you can speak a truth in so much that you become blind to everything else. Because unlike Judas, Peter had fellowship with his brothers who all believed. Now they questioned the authority of Jesus. Sometimes they questioned the authority of Jesus. They questioned his identity, but they all had each other. And they all believed and followed instructions that Jesus gave. Judas was wrapped around his theology in so much that he rejected his brothers to a point that he became a madman and then took his life. But even with that, by him taking his life, he spoke the most powerful message ever. That if you put me in a position, now talking in the aspect of Judas, if you put me in a position where I have to continue to live this life without the Messiah, then life is no life at all. You have to understand, I walked with the man. I talked with the man. I spoke with the Messiah. I saw miracles with the Messiah. The Messiah loved me and I loved him. The Messiah was with me. But if you put me in a position that I have to choose this life without the Messiah, then life is not worth it at all. You see, the story of Judas is a case of keeping it real gone wrong. In fact, it shows us the power of indecision is equivalent to death. He couldn't not have changed. Nobody could have changed his mind because he didn't have the ability to fellowship with his brothers because he was wrapped around his theology. But the idea of him to continue on living a life without the Messiah was suicide. And he would rather not live at all if he was put in a position that he had to continue to live a life without Jesus. As the book of Ecclesiastes says that everything under the sun is meaningless. You see, Judas, the one that we have forgotten, the one that we identify a spirit of the spirit of betrayal with, Judas, the one that became a disciple to an apostle, Judas, the one that Jesus loved, was able to betray him, was able to be wrapped around his reality, his truth, to a point where he loses the Messiah. And he says that the moment that you put him in a position that he has to be without the Messiah, it is not worth it. Because life without Jesus is no life at all. This is the untold story and of the Gospel of Judas. If you like more information like this, if you like content like this, just submit a like. Follow this channel as we continue to delve deep into the scriptures. God bless you.